Hey, what's going on, people? You're watching the Christianese podcast today. We're going to be discussing Blackness and Christianity and what links there are between the two. I'm joined today by two special guests. We have to my left...
Alex Brito, pastor of Mosaic Multicultural Church.
Okay, and to my right...
Ryan King, pastor of Grace Baptist Church, Wood Green.
Which is awesome. Thank you guys for joining us. So, often one of the accusations against the church is that Christianity is a white man's religion. If somebody came to you and expressed that fear or that sentiment, what would your feeling be? I'll open that up to the floor.
I would say, to start with, I would ask the question, why do you think that? Why do you feel that way? And I mean, if you were the guy and you came up to me and you said Christianity is a white man's religion, and I said, okay, why do you think that?
Yeah.
Put yourself in that guy's shoes, and
Sure.
How would they answer?
So, one of the accusations, so King James, we know, so his translation, his brand of the Bible was pushed out for numerous years. It's what our parents grew up on, it's what a lot of us were first introduced to the Bible with. We know about his involvement in the slave trade, we know about his involvement in Jamestown. How can it be that somebody who's so integral in the role of modern Christianity could be perpetrating slavery and at the same time propagating Christianity?
So I would dive in at that point and say, well, I worship King Jesus, not King James. And King Jesus was born in Brown Asia, and he immigrated as a refugee to Black Africa, and then he came back to Brown Asia, was crucified, buried, and resurrected long before Christianity ever came to white Europe. And the early church was spread, was planted, was developed by brown-skinned men and black-skinned men. One of the first converts that we read about in detail about his conversion in the book of Acts was a treasurer to the Kandaka of Meroe, which would have been in sort of Kush, Abyssinia area. So he's traditionally called the Ethiopian eunuch, but Ethiopian was a catch-all term for anyone with black skin. Ethiop, it meant burnt face, and this man was saved, and he went back to Africa and was planting churches. Lots of people on the day of Pentecost. Some of them not native Jews, some of them God-fearers, would have been black from Africa. And you even have in the first church where people were called Christians in Antioch, you have a man spelled out in Scripture that he was a black man. Simon, who was called Niger, which similar to Niger and Nigeria, that means black. Simon, the black man, was in the leadership of the church where they were first called Christians. So I think pretty comprehensively, long before, just even in the Bible, you have people who were black and followed King Jesus, and King James just misappropriated all of that stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%.
I think the good thing about this question is that you can help not only the person asking the question, but also your congregation to understand the beauty of the gospel. Because God doesn't show favoritism. So you want people actually to engage with you with those kind of questions, so you can actually preach the gospel, share the gospel, showing, you see, God is not only the God of the Jews or to the Greeks. He is a God who sent his son because he loved the world. So it's a great, I've done it in a small group at my church. And I remember this Jamaican lady hearing me saying Jesus was not white, and she was actually asking me questions. What do you mean by that? Of course he was. I was like, no way, let me show you here. And I was glad because we were studying the Gospels, and I was like, no, he wasn't. He wasn't. So I think we should not be even waiting people to ask that question. We should be preaching from the pulpit that Christianity is something beyond the color of someone. I mean, the color of our skin. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think one of the things is there seems to be almost a disconnect between modern Christianity and their view of race. And if we go back, it's got about 400 years, so we're at the 1600s, and the Christian viewpoint at that stage. And so one of the things they say within Islam, for example, that they're quite sensitive about depictions that can create issues like this. So they don't have depictions of Muhammad, for example. Whereas it seems widely across the Christian faith, white gods, Sistine chapels, white Jesus has been up in Catholic churches. There doesn't seem to be much opposition to any of this. So it feels like it breeds a certain culpability for the racialization of God that was established in the 1600s. That is, there's leftovers of that same theology now. So why is it that the church is so quiet about the racialization of God?
Or defensive, because I feel that sometimes there are people who are almost like defensive of artwork that depicts a white Jesus. I think a better angle, there's two ways you could go. There are those who could go sort of the traditional Reformed route and say these actually constitute potentially or really a violation of the Second Commandment. There are people who believe that, and I think if they are consistent and they believe that, then they of all people should not have a problem with the removal of white Jesus. There's also the other angle where people may have a more moderate view that there may be a place for artwork that not to be worshipped, but to educate. Its place for imagination and education and literacy, Bible stories and things. And I think the most helpful thing that could be said at that point would be, historically, people have made Jesus, because of their view of the incarnation, they've contextualized Jesus so that Europeans originally, I don't think they meant anything by portraying Jesus in a way that looked like them, in the same way that in China, where Christianity flourished in some form for a very long time, was even welcomed in the courts of royalty at one point. They would have seen Jesus in their imagination and therefore portrayed him in art as a Chinese man, because they just... it wasn't a globalized world, and people, though they had perhaps some interactions with people with darker skin tones, it was easier for them to grasp Jesus, God incarnate, as looking like them. But the way that has then been used, perhaps weaponized, perhaps
Perverted, I'd say.
Yeah, the way it's affected people mentally and emotionally, I think at this point in a globalized world, we have to see, maybe going forward it would be more helpful to portray Jesus realistically.
I agree with you. I think contextualization is the issue. I think, okay, let's try to see this God who became a man in our context. But as the world is getting more global and more multicultural, I think it's the time to change and to even be more biblical. So if we're going to be more biblical, what kind of picture we're going to have in order to contextualize? I mean, we are all based in London. So I think for us it's a must. we must actually reject those kind of image that doesn't actually reflect what the Bible is saying in regards to their origin, the skin color, and so on.
Because if we take the leap, and then we then have so non-whites are expected to be comfortable in their worship in and around a white Jesus, whereas I don't know if it necessarily translates in terms of would white Christians feel comfortable worshipping in and around the black Jesus. I think that could be a divisive point. And I think potentially a point that's not widely recognized. We're talking about earlier the quote, would a white God save you from white oppression? And I think if we recognize that an image here has been distorted, so that the second commandment's potentially been broken, there's repercussions of it, then perhaps there's a need to remedy something that's been broken. Because I was saying for myself, I grew up believing that God was white and that Jesus was white. If I picture God now, I still picture a white guy with a grey beard, just because I've been hit with that image so many times over time. It's impossible for me to picture God in any other light. That's what, even when Morgan Freeman did it, it just didn't feel right. So I think for
there are all sorts of reasons why.
it didn't compute, and I think that can be such a stumbling block, which in turn leads people away from the church. But I don't necessarily see anybody actively seeking to remedy that wrong.
I think one of the concerns that people have with the conversation is perhaps they don't understand where it's coming from. And so I do see some people, perhaps with the best of intentions, but maybe unhelpful, they express concern with the idea of thinking of God in terms of color, and I actually I agree with that, because I believe that God transcends color. I believe that God is the creator of color, and one who has assigned people with color. Even the first man was made in His image. That doesn't mean physical appearance. I don't believe. I think, just side note, if you're making something out of soil, it's probably going to result in someone a bit darker than myself. He's made Adam out of the dust of the ground, right?
So maybe,
and so he's probably going to be a darker man, the first man. But God transcends that. The problem is people want to drain the world of color and see white as normal or normative, and that's not helpful. And what you've just expressed about picturing God, I think there's good cause to again go back to the principles of the Ten Commandments, and some of the reasons maybe why we're not supposed to picture God, certainly not to worship Him. But the imaging of the invisible God is something very dangerous indeed. And it doesn't matter the artwork. I feel very uncomfortable with depictions of the Father, of the Spirit. I can understand the Son because the Son is the image of the invisible God, right? But when that image is in our likeness and stuff, that's when you get into problems. And we are in God's likeness, not God in ours. And does that make sense?
100%. Because I think the other dynamic I just wanted to explore was, does the church have a responsibility towards education, and education in the context of widely, some perpetrated by Christians, some by non-Christians, but a lot of Black history was burned, shut off. Like, every time you see a sphinx, for example, in Egypt, it looks like it's hit a wall or something. His nose is just shut off, and so I don't know if people even know as a society that these were systemic acts done to delete and erase Black history. If I want to view certain parts of Black history, I don't even go to Africa. I have to go to the British Museum, and whatnot, because a lot of it is in there. And literally, we're talking about graves being taken, stolen, before we even talk about things like wealth and such. And I know we were talking about Egypt before, and the contextualization of that as a place in Africa, and the fleeing of Mary and Joseph to Africa as a place, as a safe haven for Jesus when he was born and such. So I just feel like there's certain opportunities, the River Gihon, for the church to play an active role in education of the people in front of them, and perhaps outside, just thinking about the history of the church and church schools and things like that. It feels like at a certain point in time, the church made it a priority to educate Whereas now, that sentiment, it may be a me thing, but I don't necessarily see wider education as being something perpetrated by the church.
Yeah, I'm glad you actually mentioning that, because when we talk about even the church educating, if we think about some of the greatest theologians in history, Augustine, I mean, he was from Africa, and it doesn't matter what your tribe is, if you're reformed or not. I mean, we all consume a lot of his theology. And that shows there is a lot of things in his theology that actually are related to his culture background that we can't ignore. We can't ignore that. I mean, so I think the church must get involved in helping local churches to engage it in a way outside even theology. I'm not saying culture is more important than the gospel in itself, but why is Augustine saying that based on his background? And how can I apply that to my background now without simply ignoring it? Because it took for a while for me to actually realize that Augustine was an African. I always thought he was European. Do you see what I'm saying?
Because that's how he's often portrayed.
That's right, yeah.
I think all the guys in the early church are portrayed as European.
And if he was great and big, of course he was not. Do you see what I'm saying? Those misconceptions that we have.
But the early church was more African than it was European. And the church fathers, I mean, just thinking about it, we're talking about education. The center of Christian education was Africa. In fact, the center before even Christian education, just intellectual thought after the Greco-Roman days was Africa.
Timbuktu's and
and so it's amazing.
And just to add something to that, and the center for the persecution of the church, Europe.
Europe. No, you're right.
So, just to say that
exactly.
It took a while for Europe to actually embrace Christianity.
Mass bloodshed.
That's right.
I mean, the stuff that we see in Italy, even in the Bible, in Italy, and then when you have the missions going up into the darker parts of Europe with the massive bloodshed that occurred at the hands of the pagans, even in this country. But when you go to why, and this is the question I think goes back to what you've just raised, is that why do people not know this? Why do you think Augustine was European? Why do I think
during the time I was at Bible college, by the way? It's not like of course you didn't have theological training. No. I was at Bible college when I was surprised by that information.
Why when I envision Tertullian, who is the first Christian to fully formulate and articulate the biblical doctrine of the Trinity. Why is the image that pops into my head some imagination of a white guy? It's not right.
This is the first time I've heard this as well. Like, I've never heard it broken down in such a way. But then I think this is the thing. The only reason why I'd even place a burden on the church for these things is because I feel the church is responsible for some of the reason why there is a confusion and the perversion. Because when we say why, we know it's not a coincidental why or a oops. The deification of certain races was a deliberate act that is indicative of white supremacy and also meant that slaves and such would be less likely to attack or defend themselves against whites if they believed them to be some form of deity or at least closer to deification than they are. And I mean, I've heard stories growing up in such from family. You hear slave stories and such. And one of the things, if you believe in Jesus, if you never run away as a slave, if you work hard, then the Jesus, who was a ship, would come to take you back home to Africa. Like, so this perversion of the gospel that's happened and been so concurrent throughout history. It feels like because it's, I guess reconciliation would be the term, because damage is actively being done by those within the church.
Yes.
It feels somewhat burdensome that the church would actively seek to undo some of the ramifications of the damage.
Yeah. As I think about that, you mentioned the slaves, and I think one of the most interesting and inspiring but neglected areas of church history is Christianity among slaves, who were told you can't read, because to let them learn how to read, that would have informed them and educated them in a way that they would have had a longing to be free, more than even they did. And not only a longing to be free, but more tools with which to be free and to pursue freedom and all of that. But then the white people could not stop that. They couldn't stop them from learning to read. A miracle of people learning to read when they were forbidden to read, teaching themselves to, it's staggering. And demonstrative of their intellects, contra the white supremacist narrative. But teaching themselves to read. Then it's like, okay, so they can read. We're going to give them Bibles, but we're going to tear out massive chunks of it. Exodus. I think 90% of I don't remember the statistic, but such a massive chunk, especially the first 19 chapters. But then we get into the law, and then especially let's make sure that we translate this word, which actually the most natural translation is not slave, it would be indentured servant, but we're going to make sure it's translated slave, and we're going to make clear to them that this slavery is the kind of slavery they're experiencing, when actually the slavery they were in was much more akin to what the Hebrews were experiencing. And so there's all of this stuff, but then they continue to meet, and they continue to rise above this. They continue to discover that the heart of the gospel is freedom, and those who know Christ can be free indeed. And they began to see that the Christianity, as Frederick Douglass put it, the Christianity of this land is not of Christ. That this was basically Christianity appropriated by white supremacists for their own selfish, false ends, and therefore was a heretical system that was totally at variance with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so they trusted Jesus with the vibrancy and a faith and a hope that far surpassed their masters.
And that explains why they did not reject Christianity. Actually, they were like, wow, they are wrong. They are wrong. Look the beauty of the gospel. Look how diverse it is. But on the other hand, what the outcome of it was segregation, right? Like, okay, very good. You can have your church, you can have your Bible, but you can't mix. You can't mix with us. And I think that goes back to what you're saying. How are we going to educate ourselves in a way that, come on, I think it is time to come together. Okay, enough is enough. I mean, we had enough of that. Let's become less segregated, less monocultural. Let's become more multicultural, because that is the picture of the church in heaven, Revelation 7, right?
Absolutely.
So
and that's not just an eschatological hope, something that we wait for the end to see. That's something we should have some sort of experience of that now, a taste of that.
We should be like a local example of it. I mean, if we can't have a local example of it, it shows that there is something wrong. There is something wrong.
So I think when someone comes to you and says, this is a white man's religion, I think we need to be very clear that some people have a false version of Christianity that is indeed a white man's religion. I mean, we have to be real with the history. And you know, whether it's slavery or segregation or racial terrorism, I think of the Ku Klux Klan. The first iteration was just a murdering mob of vigilantes. It died. The second iteration came after D.W. Griffith's film, the first English blockbuster, Birth of a Nation, 1915. That creates the idea of the Klan as this army of Christian soldiers, and that's when we first see the cross burned. You get to the 1920s, membership of the Klan surges. You have 4 million Americans who were members of the KKK at that time. That's when they began burning crosses because they'd seen it in the film. So life is imitating art. And then it dies because of scandals. 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, integration of schools, and suddenly people are like, in the name of Jesus, claiming that the prophets of the Old Testament are on their side, speaking out against integration, because woe betide, their white children have to go to school with black boys and girls. And so they continue to burn their crosses, and at the end, when that being the end of, you know, this big social gathering and sermonizing and all of that, they'd burn the cross and they would sing Christian hymns, like the for example, one of them being the Old Rugged Cross, beautiful hymn, but they'd sing that. They really thought tragically, and so that they were representatives of Christ. What we have a responsibility to do is to realize that unless we were involved in that, and we should own that, and if we're perpetrating such systems, we should own that. We should repent of that with godly grief. But we should realize there's a distinction between moral culpability and meaningful consequence. Just because you are not morally culpable for what a bunch of racial terrorists did, that does not mean you do not have, as a pastor or as a Christian, meaningful consequences where you have to grapple with this and deal with this, re-educate yourself, re-educate people around you, and more faithfully communicate the glory of the gospel in all of its multicolored splendor.
Amen.